Welcome. The archive is now open. Tonight, from our restricted collection, we are unsealing case files documenting the unexplained phenomena of the Pacific Northwest. The accounts you are about to hear are not fiction. They've been meticulously sourced from Forestry Service incident reports, abandoned trail diaries, and redacted search and rescue audio logs and preserved within this archive for professional review. The world believes these stories are lost to time. We ensure they are not forgotten. If you believe that certain knowledge must be preserved, subscribe to the Nocturnal Archive and activate the notification bell to be alerted of our next acquisition. After reviewing these files, leave your own analysis or related experiences in the comments below. Now, find your comfort in the darkness. Let the noise of the day fade as we access the first file. Case File 89-4. Location: Olympic Peninsula, Washington State. Subject: the echo of Outpost 4. To understand the events of November 14th, one must first understand the silence, or rather, the specific quality of noise that passes for silence in the deep rainforest. Elias Vane was a man who dealt in specifics. He was a senior acoustic analyst for the Cascadia Seismic Monitoring Group, a private contractor that supplied data to both the United States Geological Survey and various university research departments. His world was not defined by what he saw, but by what he could measure. He lived in decibels, in hertz, in the scrolling green lines of a spectrogram that translated the chaotic vibrations of the Earth into orderly, readable data. For the past 19 days, Elias had been the sole occupant of Outpost 4. Outpost 4 was not a cabin in the traditional sense. It was a modular research unit, a rectangular steel container reinforced to withstand falling timber and heavy snow loads, dropped by helicopter into a narrow clearing 10 miles from the nearest logging road. It sat in the heart of the Hoh Rainforest, a place where the biomass is so dense it swallows light and sound with equal veracity. The outpost was designed to be a technological womb. Inside, the air was scrubbed and temperature-controlled, smelling faintly of ozone and recycled warmth. The walls were lined with server racks and monitoring stations, their cooling fans creating a constant, low-frequency white noise that Elias found infinitely more comforting than the voices of other people. Outside, the world was wet, cold, and indifferent. The Olympic Peninsula is unique in the North American landscape. It is a temperate rainforest, receiving upwards of 140 inches of precipitation annually. In November, the rain does not simply fall, it occupies the air. It is a physical presence, a heavy, gray curtain that descends from the cloud layer and wraps everything in a suffocating embrace. On this particular evening, the rain was relentless. It drummed against the reinforced roof of the outpost with a rhythmic intensity that sounded like thousands of small, soft fingers tapping for entry. Elias sat in the ergonomic chair at the main console, his face illuminated by the cool glow of 3 monitors. It was 2 a.m. His shift was technically over, but in the isolation of the outpost, time became fluid. There was no sunrise or sunset here, only the varying shades of gray outside the plexiglass observation window and the steady scroll of the data inside. He adjusted his glasses and typed a command into the terminal. The daily log required an entry every 6 hours, a redundancy protocol to ensure both the equipment and the operator were functioning within normal parameters. Status: nominal, he typed. External temperature: 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Precipitation rate: 0.8 inches per hour. Seismic activity: baseline. He paused at the word baseline. In his line of work, the baseline was everything. It was the standard against which all anomalies were measured. It was the known reality. For the sensors buried in the earth around the outpost, the baseline was a complex tapestry of background noise. It included the microseisms of ocean waves crashing against the coasts 30 miles to the west. It included the deep, tectonic groan of the Juan de Fuca plate subducting beneath the North American continent. It even included the vibration of heavy trucks on the highway, filtered out by algorithms that recognize the specific frequency of combustion engines. Elias took a sip of lukewarm coffee from his thermos. He enjoyed this part of the rotation, the deep night, when the data stream was clean and the world felt paused. He was a man who found safety in predictability. He trusted the machines. He trusted the physics of sound. He knew that sound was simply energy moving through matter, and energy obeyed laws. It could not lie. It could not hide. If something moved in the forest, if a rock shifted deep underground, the sensors would feel it, the computers would process it, and Elias would see it. He spun his chair slowly, checking the rack of servers behind him. The green LEDs blinked in a soothing, asynchronous rhythm. Blink, blink, blink. Everything was in order. The backup generator was in standby mode. The satellite uplink showed a strong connection despite the storm. He was completely alone, miles from civilization, yet he felt entirely secure. The steel walls of the outpost were thick. The door was secured by a heavy deadbolt and a digital keypad. He was an observer in a hardened shell, watching the wilderness without having to touch it. He stood up to stretch, his joints popping in the quiet room. He walked to the small kitchenette area in the corner of the unit to refill his water bottle. The floor was covered in industrial rubber matting, silencing his footsteps. He moved with the economy of someone who had spent years working in confined spaces. As the water filled his bottle, he listened to the rain again. The intensity had increased. The tapping on the roof had deepened into a roar, a wash of white noise that drowned out even the hum of the servers. Elias walked to the observation window. It was a thick, multi-layered pane of polycarbonate designed to resist impact. He pressed his forehead against the cold surface and looked out. He could see nothing. The external floodlights were turned off to conserve power, and without them, the darkness was absolute. It was not merely the absence of light. It was a physical weight pressing against the glass. The rain smeared the view into abstract streaks of fluid. Beyond the glass, the forest was a black void, a wall of ancient hemlock and cedar trees draped in moss that hung like wet rags. He knew what was out there. He had surveyed the perimeter in the daylight. He knew where the solar array stood. He knew where the primary sensor junction box was buried. He knew the path of the deer trail that wound through the ferns. But in the dark, stripped of visual data, the forest felt different. It felt vast and unknowable. Elias breathed on the glass, watching the condensation fog the surface, then fade. He felt a momentary flicker of primal instinct, that ancient biological warning that tells a mammal it is exposed. It was irrational, he told himself. He was inside. The elements were outside. The barrier was intact. He turned away from the window, rejecting the darkness, and returned to the comfort of his illuminated screens. He sat back down and put on his noise-canceling headphones. The roar of the rain vanished, replaced by the profound, artificial silence of active cancellation. He keyed up the audio feed from Hydrophone Array B, a set of microphones buried near a subterranean creek bed 300 yards north of the outpost. He preferred listening to the raw audio. The computer could flag events, but the human ear trained in focus could detect subtleties that algorithms sometimes missed. He closed his eyes and listened. The sound of the earth was a low rumble. He heard the rush of water in the creek, magnified by the hydrophones. He heard the shifting of gravel. He heard the wind moving through the canopy far above, a sound like distant ocean surf. It was peaceful. It was the sound of a machine working perfectly. The ecosystem was a closed loop, functioning exactly as it should, indifferent to his presence. He watched the spectrogram on the center monitor. The display showed a waterfall of colors: blue for silence, yellow for quiet sounds, red for loud events. The screen was currently awash of blue and soft greens, a visual representation of the tranquility he heard in his headphones. This was the acoustic baseline, a steady, predictable state of nature. Elias watched the scrolling lines for 10 minutes, his breathing slowing, his mind drifting into a meditative state. He was a monk of the digital age, keeping vigil over the heartbeat of the planet. Then, he saw it. It was a small detail, a minor imperfection in the data. On the far left of the spectrogram, in the frequency range usually reserved for background tectonic shifts, a faint yellow line appeared. It was brief, a pulse. Elias leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He waited. 4 seconds later, it appeared again. Another yellow pulse. Same intensity, same duration. 4 seconds later, a third pulse. Elias frowned. He reached for the keyboard, his fingers hovering over the keys. He isolated the frequency 12 Hz. It was at the very bottom of the audible spectrum, more of a vibration than a sound. He turned up the gain on the audio feed, straining to hear what the computer was seeing. Thump, pause, thump, pause, thump. It was rhythmic. It was steady. It did not have the chaotic variability of wind or water. It did not have the sharp, erratic profile of a mechanical failure. Elias took off his headphones and looked at the server rack. Was it a cooling fan crying out? A loose panel vibrating in the wind? He listened to the room. He heard only the rain and the hum. He put the headphones back on. Thump. It was cleaner now. Louder. Elias checked the timestamp. The rhythm had started 3 minutes ago. It was slowly increasing in amplitude. Whatever was causing the vibration, it wasn't just happening. It was approaching. He stared at the green line on the screen, the logical part of his brain already running through the checklist of probabilities. A diesel generator from a distant logging truck? No. The nearest road was 10 miles away through dense timber. A geological event? Magma displacement? No. The waveform was too sharp, too precise. He was the expert. He knew the library of sounds this forest could produce. He knew the scream of a cougar, the crack of a falling branch, the heavy thud of an elk's hoof. This was none of those. Elias felt the first cold trickle of unease seep into his stomach. He typed a command to record the stream to a separate file. He labeled it simply, Anomaly 1. He stared at the scrolling data, the yellow line pulsing with the regularity of a metronome. He was no longer looking at the baseline. The baseline had been breached. Outside, the rain continued to hammer against the roof, but Elias was no longer listening to the storm. He was listening to the thing underneath the storm. He sat in his chair, bathed in the green light of the monitors, and waited for the next pulse. The pulse on the monitor was hypnotic. It was a singular, vertical spike of yellow light rising from the bedrock of green static, holding its shape for a fraction of a second, and then dissolving back into the baseline. Elias Vane did not view this anomaly with fear. Not yet. In the clinical atmosphere of the Outpost, fear was an inefficient variable. He viewed it with professional annoyance. To an acoustic analyst, an unidentified signal was an error. It was a smudge on a clean window, a mathematical discrepancy that required correction. He leaned closer to the screen, the blue light reflecting in the lenses of his glasses. He adjusted the timescale of the readout, stretching the data so that the seconds became inches. He watched the rhythm unfold. The intervals were surgically precise. 4.2 seconds. Pulse. 4.2 seconds. Pulse. In nature, true regularity is a myth. The wind gusts, the rain fluctuates. Even the heartbeat of a sleeping animal has variance, speeding up and slowing down with the subtle shifts of respiration and dream cycles. Machines, on the other hand, are perfect. A piston firing, a fan spinning, a relay clicking. These things create perfect loops. Mechanical. Elias whispered to the empty room. His voice sounded flat, absorbed instantly by the acoustic foam lining the walls. He felt a measure of relief. If the sound was mechanical, it was solvable. It was likely a ground loop, an electrical interference caused by two pieces of equipment sharing a common path to the earth. Or perhaps a loose cable on the external array was swinging in the wind, striking the casing of the hydrophone with metronomic regularity. He opened the diagnostic terminal, his fingers moving fluidly across the keyboard. He initiated a standard isolation protocol. System command: isolate hydrophone array B, channels 1 through 4. System command: apply low-pass filter. Cut off 20 Hz. The speakers on the console crackled. A wash of deep, low static filled the room, sounding like the roar of a distant ocean inside a seashell. Elias turned the volume knob slowly clockwise. The static grew louder, a heavy, gray noise that vibrated the surface of the desk. He waited for the pulse. Thump. It was not a sharp sound. It was dull, wet, and heavy. It sounded like a large stone being dropped into thick mud, or perhaps a heavy boot taking a step on saturated ground. Thump. Elias checked the wind speed monitor. The anemometer on the roof was registering gusts of 30 miles per hour from the southwest. He looked back at the spectrogram. If the sound were a loose cable swinging in the wind, the frequency of the impact should match the variability of the gusts. When the wind blew harder, the cable should swing faster. When the wind died down, the rhythm should slow or stop. He watched the two data streams side by side. The wind speed graph was jagged, chaotic, rising and falling in unpredictable spikes. The anomaly was a flat line, 4.2 seconds. Unwavering. The sound was completely divorced from the environment. It was operating on its own internal logic, indifferent to the storm raging around it. Elias felt the skin on the back of his neck tighten. The diagnosis of mechanical interference was beginning to fail. He initiated a triangulation query. The Outpost utilized 4 distinct sensor clusters arranged in a wide perimeter to pinpoint the location of seismic epicenters. By measuring the millisecond delay between when a sound hit sensor A versus sensor B, the computer could calculate the exact origin of the noise. The processor hummed. A progress bar filled across the screen. Calculation complete. Source origin 47.2 degrees north, 123.8 degrees west. Distance from station 60 meters. Elevation surface level. Elias stared at the coordinates. 60 meters. That was inside the perimeter. The sensors were not picking up a distant logging truck or a deep earth tremor. They were picking up something standing just beyond the tree line, 60 meters from the door of the outpost. He swiveled his chair toward the observation window again. The blackness outside remained total. The rain continued its relentless assault on the glass, blurring the world into a dark, weeping abstract. He tried to visualize the terrain at that distance. 60 meters out was the edge of the clearing, where the solar battery bank stood. It was a flat patch of gravel and mud, surrounded by the towering wall of hemlock trees. He turned back to the audio feed. He needed more definition. The dull thud was too ambiguous. He needed to hear the texture of the sound. He typed in a new command, engaging the spectral subtraction algorithm. This software was designed to strip away steady background noises like the hiss of rain or the hum of the wind, leaving only the transient sounds behind. The roar of the static in the speakers vanished. The room fell silent again, save for the digital artifacts of the processing software, which sounded like faint, watery chirps. Elias held his breath. He leaned his ear toward the speaker mesh. Crunch. Squelch. The clarity was startling. Without the mask of the rain, the sound was undeniably physical. It was the sound of weight compressing matter. He could hear the specific friction of the gravel grinding together. He could hear the suction of wet soil releasing a heavy object. Crunch. Squelch. It was a footstep. There was no other acoustic interpretation that fit the data profile. It was the sound of something bipedal, something with significant mass shifting its weight from one leg to the other. But it wasn't walking. The triangulation data showed the source was stationary. Elias closed his eyes, constructing the image in his mind based solely on the audio evidence. Something heavy was standing in the mud, 60 meters away. It was lifting one foot, placing it down, waiting 4 seconds, and then lifting the other. Why? Animals do not march in place. A bear or an elk would move through the area, the sound fading as it distanced itself from the sensor. This thing was pacing, or waiting. Elias looked at the amplitude of the wave again. The force required to generate that seismic register was substantial. A human being, even a large man in heavy gear, would barely register a blip on these settings. To create a yellow spike at 12 hertz, the object would need to weigh upwards of 400 pounds, or it would need to be striking the ground with deliberate, calculated force. Elias reached for the station logbook, a bound ledger that sat on the corner of the desk. He picked up his pen. His hand was steady, but he felt a coldness in his fingertips. 2:14 a.m., he wrote. Detected rhythmic, low-frequency anomaly, 12 hertzes. Source localized to Sector 3, Solar Array Junction. Signal is consistent with localized impact. Suspect heavy debris or equipment failure. He paused. He looked at the word failure. He was lying to the logbook. He knew it. The acoustic signature was too clean for debris. A falling branch does not fall forever in a perfect loop. He set the pen down. He knew what protocol dictated. When a sensor array produced aberrant data that could not be cleared remotely, the operator was required to perform a visual inspection and a physical reset. The integrity of the data was paramount. If the sensor was malfunctioning, or if a bear was rubbing against the casing, the entire dataset for the night would be compromised. Elias looked at the heavy steel door of the outpost. It was locked, the deadbolt thrown. Above the door, a small red light indicated the security system was armed. He did not want to go outside. The urge to stay in the chair, to simply turn off the speaker and ignore the green line, was powerful. It was a primitive desire for the cave, for the safety of the firelight. But Elias Vane was not a primitive man. He was a scientist. He was a custodian of facts, and the fact on the screen was an error that needed to be cleared. He stood up. The chair creaked, a harsh sound in the quiet room. He walked to the locker by the door and began the process of gearing up. It was a ritual of layers. First, the heavy wool socks, then the rubber boots, reinforced with steel toes, then the yellow PVC rain slicker, stiff and smelling of chemicals. He zipped the jacket to his chin. He picked up his flashlight, a heavy mag light that felt like a truncheon in his hand. He walked back to the console one last time. He looked at the screen. The pulse was still there. 4.2 seconds. Thump. Ground loop. He said again, forcing the words into the air. Just a ground loop. He turned to the door and punched the code into the keypad. The mechanism clacked loudly, the sound of steel disengaging from steel. He turned the handle. The wind caught the door immediately, ripping it from his grip and slamming it against the outer wall. The roar of the storm flooded the cabin, instantly washing away the sterilized, hum-filled silence he had enjoyed for 3 weeks. The cold was shocking. It was a wet, penetrating cold that bypassed the wool and the rubber and went straight to the bone. Rain lashed at his face, stinging his eyes. Elias stepped out onto the metal grating of the porch. He pulled the door shut behind him, fighting the wind to latch it. He was outside now. The baseline was gone. There was only the chaos of the storm, and somewhere in the darkness, 60 meters away, the source of the rhythm. He clicked his flashlight on. The beam cut a pale, narrow tunnel through the driving rain, illuminating nothing but falling water and the glistening black trunks of the trees. He stepped off the porch and into the mud. The mud was not merely wet earth. It was a living, viscous substance that seemed to grip the rubber of his boots with every step, creating a wet suction sound that was immediately swallowed by the roar of the storm. Elias stepped off the grating and moved toward the tree line, his head bowed against the wind. The beam of his maglite was a fragile cone of white in a world of overwhelming gray. It illuminated only a few feet of space ahead of him, the glistening fronds of a sword fern, the rough, waterlogged bark of a hemlock, and the relentless, vertical streaks of the rain. He navigated by memory, and by the faint, artificial straightness of the trench line where the conduit was buried. 60 meters. In the daylight, on dry ground, it was a walk of less than a minute. In the chaotic darkness of a November squall, it felt like a descent into a different atmosphere entirely. The air here was thick with the smell of ozone and decaying cedar, a scent that was sharp and ancient. Elias counted his steps. 20. 30. He stopped for a moment to wipe the water from his glasses. The rain was cold enough to numb his exposed skin instantly. He squinted into the dark, trying to orient himself. To his left, he could just make out the skeletal outline of the solar array, the panels angled steeply to shed the water. They reflected the weak scatter of his flashlight like black mirrors. The junction box for sensor array B was mounted on a waist-high steel stanchion just beyond the panels. It was a NEMA 4 rated enclosure, industrial gray, designed to be impervious to water, dust, and ice. It was the kind of equipment that did not fail. It had to be compromised. Elias moved forward, his boots sliding on the loose gravel that surrounded the array. He kept the beam of the light focused on the ground, watching for the cable run. He reached the stanchion. He raised the light. The beam hit the gray metal of the box. Elias stopped. The door of the enclosure was not closed. It was standing wide open, swinging slightly in the wind, the metal hinges groaning with a sound that was lost in the gale. Elias stood perfectly still, the rain hammering against his yellow slicker. A sudden, cold clarity washed over him, displacing the physical chill of the storm. He knew the protocols for this equipment. The enclosure was secured with a dual-class mechanism that required significant thumb pressure to release. It was designed specifically to keep curious bears and raccoons from accessing the sensitive electronics inside. A bear could not manipulate the clasps. A bear would simply rip the box from its mounting or crush the metal with brute force. There was no crushing. The box was pristine. The paint was unchipped. The steel stanchion was not bent. The box had been opened, deliberately. Elias stepped closer, the gravel crunching softly under his weight. He shone the light directly into the interior of the enclosure. The horror he felt was not a spike of adrenaline, but a slow, curdling sensation in his stomach. It was the nausea of a mathematician looking at an equation that ends in an impossible number. Inside the box, the terminal block, the plastic strip where the sensor wires connected to the main trunk line, was exposed. The wires had not been chewed. They had not been torn. They had not been cut. They had been unwoven. Elias leaned in, his nose inches from the open box, squinting through the rain-streaked lenses of his glasses. The cable used for the hydrophones was a complex, shielded, twisted pair. It consisted of a thick rubber outer jacket, a layer of foil shielding, and then 4 individual copper strands, each insulated in color-coded plastic, all braided together in a tight helix. To separate them required a wire stripper, a blade, and a steady hand. Here, the outer rubber jacket had been peeled back cleanly, as if stripped by a precise incision. The foil shielding was folded back like the wrapper of a piece of gum, and the copper strands. Elias reached out with a gloved hand, then hesitated. He pulled the glove off, exposing his pale, wet fingers to the freezing air. He needed to feel it. He touched the wires. The copper strands had been untwisted. They were splayed out in a perfect fan, separated from one another with terrifying delicacy. The plastic insulation on each strand was intact. The copper itself was gleaming and unoxidized, suggesting the damage was very recent. This was not the work of a claw or a tooth. This was not the result of wind damage or falling debris. This required dexterity. It required an understanding of how the cable was constructed. It required fingers that could manipulate threads of copper no thicker than a fishing line. Elias stared at the splayed wires, his mind racing through a catalog of local fauna, desperately trying to find an animal that fit the evidence. Raccoons had dexterity, yes. They could open simple latches, but they could not peel back industrial rubber shielding without leaving chaotic shred marks. They could not unbraid copper without bending or breaking the metal. This was surgical. He moved the flashlight beam lower, illuminating the bottom of the open enclosure box. There was mud inside the door. It was a single, heavy smear of gray clay, dragged across the white instruction label adhered to the inner metal surface. Elias adjusted the angle of the light to catch the texture of the mud. If a bear had swiped the box open, there would be claw marks in the clay. If a human had done it, there would be the distinct ridges of a fingerprint, or the texture of a glove, leather grain, knitting, or the diamond pattern of a grip. The smear was perfectly smooth. It looked as though a spatula had been dragged across the metal, or a piece of wet leather, or a hand that possessed no friction ridges, no pores, and no lines. Elias brought his face closer. He could smell the mud. It smelled of the deep earth, of the anaerobic soil found feet below the surface, not the loose topsoil of the clearing. He looked at the latch mechanism again. It was clean. No scratches, no tool marks. Whoever or whatever had opened this box had known exactly how it worked. They had applied the necessary pressure to the release tabs and swung the door open with a familiarity that implied practice. Elias slowly pulled his hand back. He put his glove back on, his fingers trembling slightly, though he told himself it was merely the cold. He directed his flashlight beam at the ground around the stanchion. The gravel was disturbed. The heavy rain was working quickly to erase the evidence, turning the ground into a slurry, but he could still see the depressions. They were not footprints. They were localized compressions in the gravel, deep and round, as if a heavy pole had been pressed into the earth. There was no shape of a boot, no heel, no toe, just these deep, cylindrical divots, spaced unevenly around the junction box. Elias shone the light further out, tracing the line of the sensor cable as it disappeared into the darkness of the tree line. The cable was slack. The tension was gone because the connection had been severed at the terminal block. He stood alone in the dark, the wind whipping his raincoat around his legs. The realization settled over him with the weight of the rain, the rhythmic thumping he had heard on the console, the 12 hertz pulse. It hadn't been an anomaly. It hadn't been a malfunction. It had been a test. Whatever stood 60 meters away had not just been pacing. It had been interacting with the system. It had found the sensor line. It had followed the line to the box. It had opened the box. And then it had manipulated the wires. It wasn't trying to break the machine. It was trying to see how the machine listened. Elias turned off his flashlight. For a second, the darkness was blinding. He stood in the absolute void, listening. He expected to hear movement. He expected the snap of a twig or the heavy breathing of a large animal. He heard only the rain. But the hair on the back of his neck was standing up, prickling against the damp wool of his collar. He felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. He felt as though he were standing in the center of a bright room while the audience watched from behind a two-way mirror. The silence of the forest was a lie. The absence of noise was not an absence of presence. Elias turned the flashlight back on. The beam shook, just once, a betrayal of his nerves. He forced his hand to steady. He did not run. He did not scramble back to the cabin. He turned with deliberate, measured movements, keeping the light pointed at the ground, and began to walk back toward the outpost. He walked with the stiff, mechanical gait of a man who was trying very hard not to look behind him. He counted his steps again. 30, 20. The outline of the outpost emerged from the gloom, a dark, rectangular monolith. He had never been so happy to see a slab of steel in his life. He reached the porch. He stepped onto the grating. He reached for the door handle. He paused. On the metal surface of the door, right next to the keypad, there was a smear of gray clay. It was identical to the one inside the junction box. Smooth, featureless, wet. Elias stared at it. He had been inside the cabin for 3 weeks. He had not been outside since the supply drop. He had not tracked this mud. The smear was fresh. The water running down the door hadn't washed it away yet. It meant that while Elias was inside, watching the screen, listening to the rhythm, something had been standing right here, on the porch, listening to him. Elias punched the code into the keypad. His fingers felt numb and thick. 1, 4, 9, 0. The lock clicked. He opened the door, slipped inside, and slammed it shut, throwing the deadbolt with a violence that echoed in the small room. He stood with his back against the steel, breathing hard, the smell of the wet forest dripping from his clothes onto the rubber floor. The room was exactly as he had left it. The monitors were glowing. The servers were humming. But the sound in the room had changed. Elias stripped off his hood, his ears straining against the silence. The speakers on the console were still active. The static from the spectral subtraction program was still hissing softly, and underneath the hiss, there was a new sound. It wasn't the thump of the ground anymore. It was a wet, sliding sound. Shh, shh, pause, shh. It was the sound of a wet hand moving across a smooth surface. Elias looked at the observation window, the heavy black curtain of the night pressed against the glass. The sound was coming from the speakers. The hydrophones were picking it up. The thing wasn't at the junction box anymore. It wasn't 60 meters away. The sound was loud, close. It was right outside the wall. The sliding sound ceased, absorbed by the heavy insulation of the outpost walls, but the implication of proximity lingered in the air like the scent of the stagnant mud on his boots. Elias Vane did not panic. Panic creates noise, and noise corrupts data. Instead, he engaged a series of deliberate, mechanical actions designed to reassert control over his environment. He checked the deadbolt. He engaged the secondary friction latch. He verified the integrity of the seal on the heavy steel door. He was inside. The machine was sealed. The variables of the storm were once again external. Elias moved to the locker and stripped off his wet gear. He performed this task with rigid precision, placing the yellow slicker on its hook and aligning his boots on the rubber matting. He needed the routine. He needed the familiarity of protocol to steady the tremor that had taken residence in his hands. The room was warm. The server fans hummed their constant, white noise lullaby. The smell of ozone and coffee returned, pushing back the odor of the wet earth. He walked back to the console. He sat down. The monitors were waiting for him. The green lines scrolled endlessly, indifferent to the intrusion at the door. Elias looked at the audio log. The file he had initiated before leaving Anomaly 1 was still recording. The waveform was currently flat, registering only the ambient hum of the room and his own breathing. He stopped the recording. He saved the file. He needed to know what the sensors had heard while he was outside. He needed to construct a timeline of the event based on empirical evidence rather than the adrenaline-fueled impressions of his own memory. He opened the file in the editing suite. The waveform appeared on the center screen, a long, jagged landscape of blue peaks and valleys representing the last 15 minutes of acoustic data. Elias put on his headphones. The noise-canceling cup sealed around his ears, creating a vacuum of silence that was instantly filled by the digital playback. He scrubbed the timeline back to the moment he opened the door, 2 hours, 18 minutes, and 14 seconds. He pressed play. The sound was violent. The wind roared into the microphone, a wash of distortion that clipped the levels into the red. Then came the heavy clack thud of the door closing. Then, the silence of the exterior, colored by the relentless drumming of the rain. Elias closed his eyes, visualizing his own movements based on the sounds. Crunch, crunch, crunch. He heard his own boots on the gravel. The cadence was brisk, nervous. Crunch, crunch, stop. That was where he had paused to wipe his glasses. Elias listened to the silence in the recording. In the gap between his footsteps, he expected to hear only the rain. Instead, he heard a texture. It was faint, buried deep in the noise floor of the recording, but it was there. It was a soft, wet suction sound. Squelch. It occurred exactly 1.5 seconds after his own footstep. Elias opened his eyes. He zoomed in on the waveform. He saw his own footstep, a sharp, high-amplitude spike. And right behind it, like a shadow, was a second, smaller bump in the data. He played the next section. Crunch. Elias, stepping. Squelch. The shadow. Crunch. Elias, stepping. Squelch. The shadow. Elias felt a coldness spread through his chest. He had not been walking alone. The thing had been moving with him. It had been stepping when he stepped, stopping when he stopped. It was not stalking him in the traditional sense. It was mimicking him. It was attempting to match his rhythm, to hide its own movement inside the sound of his. He scrubbed the timeline forward to the moment he reached the junction box. He heard the rustle of his raincoat. He heard his own breathing, sharp and shallow, magnified by the proximity to the recorder on his lapel. Inhale, exhale, inhale. Elias isolated the frequency range of human respiration. He applied a bandpass filter to strip away the wind and the rain. The sound of his own breathing became clear, a ragged, organic loop. But there was a second loop. Underneath his own breath, perfectly synchronized but phase-shifted by a fraction of a second, was another sound. It was not the breath of a mammal. It did not have the wet, warm friction of air moving through a throat. It sounded dry. It sounded like air being forced through a paper tube, or like dead leaves sliding over stone. Click, click, click. Elias stared at the screen. The two waveforms were nearly identical in shape. The entity was not just breathing. It was copying the specific pattern of Elias' fear. When Elias' breath hitched, the shadow breath hitched. When Elias held his breath to inspect the wires, the shadow sound ceased instantly. It was learning. It was calibrating itself. Elias watched the cursor move across the screen. He was approaching the end of the recording, the moment where he had turned to walk back to the cabin. He remembered the feeling of being watched. He remembered the skin prickling on his neck. He listened to the footsteps returning. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The shadow footsteps were closer now. The delay had shortened. The squelch was overlapping with the crunch. And then he heard the voice. It was not a voice in any recognizable sense. It was a collection of sounds arranged to approximate a voice. It was a collage of acoustic debris. It happened at 2 hours, 24 minutes, and 12 seconds, just as Elias was reaching for the door handle. Buried in the wind, barely audible, something spoke. Elias froze. He stopped the playback. He rewound 3 seconds. He turned the volume up to the maximum safe limit. He played it again. The sound was high-pitched and distorted, like a radio signal breaking up, but the cadence was unmistakable. Gound. Oop. Elias sat perfectly still. The blood pounded in his ears, louder than the storm outside. He rewound it again. He slowed the playback speed by 50%. Grrr round. Loop. Ground loop. It was his own voice. It was the phrase he had spoken inside the cabin 10 minutes earlier. Just a ground loop. He had spoken it to the empty room. He had spoken it to the walls. The entity had heard him. It had been standing on the porch, pressing itself against the steel, listening to the vibrations of his voice through the metal. And now, it was repeating the data back to him. But the tone was wrong. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't aggressive. It was inquisitive. It sounded like a child trying out a new word, testing the shape of it in a mouth that was not designed for speech. Ground. Loop. Elias took the headphones off. He placed them on the desk with trembling hands. He pushed the chair back and stood up, putting distance between himself and the console. The room felt smaller. The walls, which had always felt like a fortress, now felt like a cage. The entity wasn't just biological. It wasn't just a bear or a man in the woods. It was an acoustic mimic. It absorbed sound. It processed patterns. It understood that sound was the primary method of communication in this environment, and it had established a baseline. Elias looked at the heavy steel door. He looked at the smear of gray clay near the keypad. It knew his breathing. It knew his walk. It knew his voice. And if it had been listening at the door, it knew the code. The keypad emitted a specific tone for each number. Beep, 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 beep. A high, medium, low, and high pitch. A musical sequence that opened the lock. Elias looked at the keypad status light. It was red, locked, but for the first time, he realized that the security of the outpost relied on the assumption that the intruder operated on force, not frequency. He walked to the breaker panel on the far wall. He opened the cover. He found the breaker labeled External Peripherals, Access Control. He flipped the switch. The red light on the door died. The electronic lock was now disabled. The deadbolt was the only thing holding the door shut. A physical bar of steel. Elias backed away until he hit the edge of the server rack. He slid down to the floor, sitting in the narrow aisle between the humming machines. He needed to be quiet. He needed to stop generating data. He drew his knees to his chest. He controlled his breathing, forcing it into a slow, unnatural rhythm. Inhale for 4. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. He would not give it a pattern to copy. He would become random. He would become silent. He sat in the green glow of the server lights, waiting. And then, from the speakers on the console, which he had forgotten to mute, came a sound. It was the sound of a keypad. Beep 1, beep 4, beep 9, beep 0. It was a perfect recording of the entry code, played back through the wet paper tube throat of the thing outside. Then, the sound of a mechanical clack, the sound of a lock disengaging, but the door did not open. The power was cut. The signal had nowhere to go. There was a pause, a silence that felt heavy and confused. Then, a soft, rhythmic tapping began on the steel of the door. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't knocking. It was typing. It was tapping out the code on the metal, trying to understand why the input was no longer producing the output. It was troubleshooting. Elias Vane closed his eyes and pressed his hands over his ears, but he could still feel the vibration of the tapping in the floor. The machine was trying to come inside. The tapping on the door ceased as abruptly as it had begun, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the steel itself. Elias Vane knew that the troubleshooting phase was over. The entity had determined that the keypad was no longer a viable interface. It had tested the input, observed the lack of output, and abandoned the mechanism with the cold efficiency of a logic gate switching states. Elias remained on the floor for several minutes, his back pressed against the server rack, waiting for the sound of brute force. He expected the squeal of metal tearing, or the heavy, rhythmic impact of a shoulder against the door. But the violence did not come. Instead, the acoustic environment shifted again. The faint, wet sliding sound returned to the speakers, but it was receding. The source was moving away from the door, drifting back toward the perimeter of the clearing. It was retreating, or it was repositioning. Elias forced himself to stand. His legs were stiff, his circulation sluggish from the adrenaline constriction. He needed visual confirmation. The audio data had become a source of psychological contamination. He could no longer trust what he heard, because he knew the thing outside could generate whatever sound it chose. He needed to see. He moved to the equipment locker and retrieved the FLIR thermal imaging monocular. It was a handheld unit, heavy and rubberized, designed to inspect overheating transformers on the solar array. He walked to the observation window. He did not turn on the interior lights. He kept the room in darkness, illuminated only by the soft, blinking constellations of the server LEDs and the pale green wash of the seismic monitors. Elias pressed the rubber eye cup of the monocular to his right eye and thumbed the power switch. The device hummed, a microscopic vibration against his cheekbone. The viewfinder flared to life, presenting the world in a monochrome palette of heat. White was hot, black was cold, gray was ambient. He scanned the glass. The window itself was a cool gray. The rain streaking down the outside surface appeared as dark, vertical scratches. Elias looked through the pane, focusing the lens on the clearing beyond. The world revealed by the thermal sensor was a ghostland. The rain was a curtain of cold static. The trees were towering pillars of dark gray, retaining a faint, residual warmth from the daylight hours. The ground was a mottled black soup of mud and standing water. Elias swept the clearing, moving the view from left to right. He saw the sharp, angular outline of the solar array. The panels were black squares, colder than the surrounding air. He saw the stanchion of the junction box, and then, standing near the edge of the tree line, 20 yards from the window, he saw the anomaly. Elias lowered the monocular for a second, blinking into the darkness with his naked eye. He saw nothing but the void of the night. He raised the thermal unit again. It was there, but it was wrong. In thermal imaging, living things are beacons. A deer, a bear, even a small rodent glows with the brilliant white intensity of metabolic heat. They are fires, burning in a cold landscape. The figure standing by the trees was not white. It was black. It was darker than the trees. It was darker than the rain. It was a void in the thermal spectrum, a silhouette of absolute zero standing against the gray background of the forest. It absorbed heat. It did not generate it. Elias steadied his breathing, fighting the urge to look away. He adjusted the focus ring, sharpening the edges of the silhouette. It was tall, disproportionately so. It stood perhaps 7 feet high, its posture slack and disjointed, like a marionette with its strings cut. Its arms hung low, the hands reaching down past where the knees should be. It was facing the cabin. Elias stood motionless in the dark server room, a man of science looking at a physical impossibility. Thermodynamics dictated that energy could not be destroyed, only transferred. Biology dictated that life required heat. This thing was a violation of the laws that govern the universe. The figure moved. It did not walk with the heavy, rhythmic gait Elias had heard on the audio recording. It flowed. The black silhouette seemed to elongate and contract, sliding over the ground without raising its feet, moving with a fluid, liquid grace that was nauseating to watch. It stopped next to a large hemlock tree. Elias watched as the entity raised one of its long, cold arms. It placed a hand against the trunk of the tree. Elias glanced at the main console monitor, specifically at the readout for Geophone Cluster 4, which was buried at the root system of that very tree. The figure tapped the tree. Tap. On the screen, the green line jumped. A perfect, vertical spike. The figure tapped again. Tap. The monitor spiked. Tap. The monitor spiked. Elias looked back through the monocular. The figure was not looking at the tree. It was looking at the cabin. It was looking directly at the observation window. It knew Elias was watching. And more importantly, it knew Elias was recording. The realization hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. The entity wasn't just mimicking sound. It understood the network. It understood that the forest was wired, that the ground was sensitive, that every vibration was being converted into data and displayed on a screen inside the steel box. It was testing the input mechanism. The figure kept its hand on the tree. It began to tap a rhythm. Tap, 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 tap. Elias looked at the screen. The seismic drum drew the pattern in jagged green peaks. Peak, 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 peak. It was a heartbeat. It was the same 12 Hz rhythm it had broadcast earlier. It was demonstrating control. It was showing Elias that it could touch the world anywhere it wanted, and Elias would feel it in his machines. Then, the breach of logic occurred. The figure removed its hand from the tree. It stepped back, standing perfectly still in the rain. Elias looked at the monitor. The green line should have gone flat. The stimulus was removed. The vibration had ceased. The laws of physics demanded that the sensor return to the baseline, but the monitor did not go flat. The green line continued to spike. Peak, 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 peak. Elias looked back through the thermal scope. The figure was motionless. Its arms were at its sides. It was not touching the tree. It was not stomping the ground. He looked at the screen. Peak, 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 peak. The data was arriving without a source. The entity was no longer inputting a signal into the physical world. It was bypassing the sensor entirely. It was injecting the data directly into the system. It wasn't just outside the cabin. It was inside the code. Elias felt a profound, vertiginous sense of unreality. He gripped the edge of the console to steady himself. This was the collapse of his expertise. He was a listener. He interpreted the language of the Earth. But the Earth was no longer speaking. The machine was speaking, and it was lying. The entity raised its arm again. It pointed a long, featureless finger directly at the observation window. On the console, every monitor went black. The green lines vanished. The spectrograms disappeared. The server status lights blinked out. The hum of the cooling fans died. The silence that rushed into the room was absolute. The artificial white noise was gone. The protection of the technology was gone. Elias lowered the monocular. He stood in the dark, silent room. Through the thick glass, he could see nothing but the night, but he knew the thermal void was still there. He waited for the power to come back on. He waited for the backup generator to kick in. It did not. The batteries were full. The circuits were redundant. There was no mechanical reason for a total shutdown. The system hadn't failed. It had been turned off. Elias realized then that the troubleshooting at the keypad had not been a failure. The entity hadn't failed to open the door. It had simply realized that the door was a crude method of entry. It didn't need to break the steel. It didn't need to pick the lock. It had simply asked the house to stop breathing, and the house had obeyed. Elias backed away from the window. His boots squeaked softly on the rubber floor, the sound terrifyingly loud in the dead air. He retreated to the corner of the room, sliding down until he hit the floor. He pulled his knees to his chest. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside, the darkness was total. Elias sat and listened. He listened not to the speakers, or the servers, or the hum of the grid. He listened to the silence of the dead machines. And then, from the black monitor screen on the desk, the screen that had no power, the screen that was disconnected from the world, came a sound. It was a soft, digital chirp. Beep. It was the sound of a file opening. Elias held his breath. From the unpowered speakers of the dead console, a voice whispered into the room. Ground. Loop. It was his own voice. Clear. Crisp. High fidelity. The entity had saved the file, and now it was playing it back. Not from the hard drive, from the silence itself. The voice died as quickly as it had appeared, fading into the dead air of the unpowered room without an echo. Elias Vane did not move. He did not scramble for the door, nor did he attempt to force the breaker switch again. He understood, with the cold clarity of a man watching a mathematical proof resolve, that the variables had shifted. The outpost was no longer a shelter. It was a container, and he was merely a component within it, isolated in the dark. The silence that followed was heavy, possessing a physical density. Without the constant, white noise hum of the server fans, the room lost its artificial warmth. The silence felt old. It felt like the silence of deep caves or the bottom of the ocean, places where machinery had never belonged. Elias sat in the narrow aisle between the server racks, his back pressed against the cold steel of the cabinet. He drew his knees up to his chest, making himself small. He controlled his breathing, forcing the air through his nose in slow, measured streams to minimize the sound. He listened. The room ticked. It was the sound of thermal contraction. The servers, which ran hot 24 hours a day, were beginning to cool. The metal casings expanded and contracted as the heat dissipated, producing sharp, rhythmic clicks that sounded like the legs of insects tapping against the walls. Tick, pause, tick. Elias focused on this sound. It was mechanical. It was explainable. It was a tether to the laws of physics that still operated inside the box, even if they had been suspended outside of it. Beyond the walls, the storm had shifted its temper. The wind had died down, leaving only the rain. It fell vertically now, a steady, monotonous drumming on the roof. It was no longer an assault. It was a shroud. Elias closed his eyes. In the absolute darkness, vision was a liability. It strained the brain, forcing it to search for patterns in the grain of the blackness. Listening was safer. He heard the sound again. It came from the north wall, the side of the cabin facing the dense tree line. Shh, shh. It was slow, deliberate. It was the sound of friction against the corrugated steel siding of the outpost. The entity was touching the house. Elias visualized it. He imagined the long, featureless hand he had seen through the thermal scope. He imagined the palm, smooth as wet clay, pressing against the cold metal. It was sliding along the perimeter. It was exploring the texture of the barrier. It was searching for a seam, a gap, a vibration. Or perhaps it was simply feeling the shape of this foreign object that had been dropped into its forest. Elias turned his head slowly, tracking the sound as it moved toward the corner of the room. The wall was 3 inches thick. It consisted of an outer steel skin, a layer of high-density foam insulation, a vapor barrier, and the interior composite paneling. 3 inches of material separated Elias from the thing outside. He could hear the pressure behind the movement. The steel skin groaned faintly, a low-frequency harmonic that vibrated through the frame of the building. The entity was heavy. It leaned against the structure with a mass that defied its slender silhouette. Elias reached into the pocket of his shirt. His fingers closed around the cold metal of his personal dictaphone. It was a small, analog recorder he used for field notes, powered by 2 AA batteries. It was entirely independent of the outpost's grid. He pulled it out. He held it close to his mouth. He debated turning it on. The click of the mechanical button would be loud in the silence. The entity would hear it, but the entity already knew he was there. It had played his own voice back to him. Secrecy was no longer a defense. Elias pressed the record button. Click. The wheel inside the device began to spin, a faint whir of magnetic tape. Elias whispered. His voice was barely a breath, a ghost of sound pushing past his lips. Log entry. Time unknown. System failure total. He paused, listening to the sliding sound on the wall. It had stopped at the click. The entity was listening. Elias continued, whispering to the tape, and to the thing outside. The anomaly is intelligent. It is not aggressive in a biological sense. It is investigative. It mimics acoustic data. It mimics input protocols. He swallowed. The back of his throat was dry. It accessed the system. It did not break the door. It bypassed the sensor array and injected a signal directly into the processor. It understands the architecture of the monitoring network. The sliding sound resumed. It was louder now. It had turned the corner. It was moving along the east wall, toward the door. Shh, shh. Elias closed his eyes tighter. It is curious, he whispered. That is the danger. It is not hungry. Hunger can be sated. Hunger has a limit. Curiosity does not. It wants to know how the machine works. It wants to know how we listen. He felt a shiver run through him, a tremor that started in his spine and ended in his fingertips. I am the component it does not understand. I am the biological element inside the mechanical shell. It wants to see the source of the data. The sliding sound reached the door. Elias held his breath. He waited for the handle to turn. He waited for the heavy thud against the steel, but the handle did not move. Instead, he heard a soft, wet squeak against the glass of the small viewport set into the door. The entity was looking in. Elias knew that if he opened his eyes, if he turned his head toward the door, he would see it. Even in the dark, he would sense the void where the light should be. He would feel the weight of its attention. He kept his eyes closed. He focused on the whir of the tape recorder. "I am remaining stationary," he whispered. "I am minimizing output. I will not give it more data. I will be silent." He clicked the recorder off. The room returned to absolute stillness. Time lost its structure. Without the clock on the monitor, without the hum of the servers, the night became a singular, endless moment. Elias drifted. He entered a state of hypnagogic suspension, a twilight zone between wakefulness and sleep where the brain attempts to conserve energy. His body temperature dropped. His heart rate slowed. He became part of the room. He was just another piece of cooling hardware, sitting in the dark. He was aware of the cold seeping through the floor. The rubber matting offered little insulation against the freezing ground beneath the outpost. The cold moved into his legs, numbing the nerves, turning his feet into heavy blocks of ice. He welcomed the cold. It dulled the fear. It made his thoughts slow and viscous, like oil in an engine that has been turned off. Outside, the rain continued its work. It washed the roof. It washed the walls. It washed the world. The sliding sound did not return, but Elias knew the entity had not left. He could feel the pressure of it. The air in the room felt compressed, as if the atmosphere outside was heavier than the atmosphere inside. He sat in the dark, and he waited for the sun. Hours passed. They were measured not in minutes, but in the slow, rhythmic changes of the storm. The rain lightened. The heavy drumming on the roof faded to a soft, consistent patter. The wind shifted again, coming now from the east, carrying the sound of the ocean miles away. Elias opened his eyes. The darkness in the room had changed. It was no longer the absolute, suffocating black of the deep night. It was a soft, granular gray. The observation window was beginning to glow. It was not light, exactly. It was the absence of darkness. It was the deep indigo of the pre-dawn, the time when the forest begins to wake up. Elias did not move. He watched the window. He watched the shapes of the room resolve themselves, the silhouette of the server rack, the curve of the chair, the blank, dead square of the monitor. The light grew stronger. It turned from indigo to the color of wet slate. Elias looked at the door. The viewport was empty. There was no face pressed against the glass. There was no shadow blocking the light. He listened. He heard the rain. He heard the wind. He heard the distant, harsh cry of a jay waking up in the canopy. The silence of the anomaly was gone. The normal acoustic baseline of the forest was returning. Elias slowly extended his legs. His joints popped, loud and dry in the quiet room. He grimaced at the pain of the blood returning to his frozen limbs. He placed his hands on the floor and pushed himself up. He stood unsteadily, bracing himself against the server cabinet. He walked to the console. He looked at the dead monitors. They were black mirrors, reflecting his own pale, exhausted face. He looked at the logbook on the desk. It lay open to his last entry, system failure. He closed the book. He walked to the observation window. He did not pick up the thermal monocular. He did not want to see the heat. He wanted to see the truth. He looked out. The clearing was gray and washed out. The rain fell in a fine mist. The trees stood like iron bars against the sky. The solar array was intact. The stanchion of the junction box stood in the mud, the door still swinging slightly in the wind. The clearing was empty. There was no black silhouette. There were no long arms reaching for the trees. Elias leaned his forehead against the cold glass. His breath fogged the surface. He looked down at the bottom of the window, where the glass met the steel frame of the wall. There, on the outside of the pane, was a mark. It was faint, visible only because of the condensation clinging to the glass. It was an oval, a smudge of grease or oil that repelled the water. It was the size of a human face, but it had no features, no nose, no lips, No brow ridge, just a smooth, perfect oval pressed against the glass. And inside the oval, tracing the shape of where eyes should be, were two vertical streaks, as if the thing had wept oil while it watched him. Elias stepped back. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the night was over. The test was complete. The entity had gathered its data. It had seen the machine. It had seen the man inside the machine, and it had decided to leave him there. For now. Elias turned away from the window. He looked at the silent room. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the dictaphone. He placed it on the desk, next to the closed logbook. He would not turn the power back on. He would not reboot the servers. He would not send a signal. He would sit in the gray light and wait for the extraction team. He sat down in the chair. He folded his hands in his lap. He closed his eyes, and he listened to the rain washing the face off the window. The rain continued to fall for another 36 hours, a relentless, washing torrent that seemed determined to scrub the world clean of any evidence that the night had ever happened. Elias Vane remained in the chair. He did not sleep. He did not eat. He simply maintained his vigil, watching the gray light of the day fade back into the charcoal gloom of the evening, and then brighten again into the second morning. He was a statue of patience, a biological component waiting for retrieval. The extraction team arrived at 0900 hours on November 16th. The sound of the helicopter was the first intrusion of the outside world. It began as a low throb in the distance, distinct from the wind, a mechanical rhythm that grew in intensity until it vibrated the steel walls of the outpost. Elias did not feel relief. He felt a distant, clinical detachment. The arrival of the machine meant the end of the isolation, but it also meant the beginning of the explanation, and he knew, with the weary certainty of a man who has seen the impossible, that there were no words in the English language capable of explaining the empty thermal void or the splayed copper wires. He stood up when the rotor wash began to slap against the siding. He picked up his bag. He picked up the logbook. He left the dictaphone on the desk. He walked to the door. He threw the deadbolt. The door opened easily. The seal broke with a soft hiss of equalizing pressure. Elias stepped out onto the metal grating. The downdraft from the helicopter flattened the ferns in the clearing and whipped the rain into a frenzy. A crewman in a flight suit jumped from the hovering skid, ducking low, running toward the cabin. Elias met him on the porch. He did not speak. He simply nodded, pulled his hood up, and walked toward the aircraft. He did not look at the junction box. He did not look at the tree line. He kept his eyes on the metal skid of the helicopter, focusing on the rivet patterns, on the mechanical reality of the transport. He climbed inside. The crewman strapped him in. The turbine whined, the pitch increased, and the earth fell away. Elias watched through the plexiglass window as Outpost 4 shrank into a small, gray rectangle swallowed by the vast, indifferent green of the rainforest. It looked insignificant. It looked like a toy block, dropped in deep grass. He closed his eyes and leaned his head against the vibration of the fuselage. He slept before they cleared the tree line. The debriefing took place in a windowless room at the Cascadia Seismic Headquarters in Seattle. The air was dry and smelled of commercial carpet cleaner. The fluorescent lights hummed with a harsh, aggressive buzz that made Elias' teeth ache. He sat across from the director of operations and a risk assessment officer. They had the logbook. They had the incident report. They asked about the outage. They asked about the sensor failure. They asked why the backup generator had not engaged. Elias gave them the answers they wanted. He gave them the answers that fit the baseline. Catastrophic inverter failure, he said. His voice was steady, flat, stripped of all inflection. The storm caused a surge in the grounding array. It fried the control board. I couldn't reset it manually. The director nodded, making a note. It was a plausible explanation. It accounted for the loss of power. It accounted for the silence. They asked about the junction box. The field technicians who had gone in to secure the site had reported that the wiring was destroyed. Wind damage, Elias said. Debris impact. A branch must have hit the stanchion. The risk assessment officer frowned, tapping his pen on the table. The report says the wires were unbraided, not cut. Elias looked at the man. He looked at his clean hands, his manicured fingernails, his tie, He looked at a man who lived in a world of asphalt and glass, a world where physics was a law that was never broken. "The wind does strange things in the canyon," Elias said softly. "Turbulence, vibration, it can work things loose." They accepted this. They had to accept it, because the alternative was to accept that something in the forest had fingers capable of untying a knot that required tools to fasten. They asked him if he wanted to return to the rotation after his mandatory rest period. Elias looked at the fluorescent light. He listened to the hum. It was 60 hertz, the frequency of the American power grid. It was a safe sound, a human sound. "No," he said. "I am resigning." Effective immediately. He did not offer a reason. He did not claim stress or trauma. He simply stated the fact and signed the paperwork. He left the building an hour later. He walked out into the city rain, which felt thin and weak compared to the deluge in the rainforest. He disappeared into the crowd, a man who carried a silence inside him that the noise of the city could not touch. The investigation into the failure of Outpost 4 was concluded 2 weeks later. The official finding was weather-induced equipment failure exacerbated by operator error. The equipment was replaced. The sensor array was upgraded. The junction boxes were fitted with heavier, tamper-resistant locks, but there was one detail that was never included in the official report. It was buried in the technical addendum, filed by the IT forensics team responsible for recovering the data from the station's hard drives. They had attempted to retrieve the logs from the night of November 14th. They hoped to recover the seismic data, the audio recordings, the system diagnostics. They found nothing. The hard drives were not just empty, they were wiped. The magnetic platters had been subjected to a field of such intensity that the binary code had been scrambled into meaningless noise. It was the kind of corruption usually seen in equipment exposed to an MRI machine or a solar flare. Every second of data from the moment Elias saw the yellow pulse to the moment the sun rose had been erased, except for one file. It was found in the cache memory of the audio processor, a temporary fragment that had survived the purge. It was a 4-second audio clip. The technicians played it. They expected static. They expected the roar of the storm. Instead, they heard a voice. It was high fidelity, clear, and unmistakably the voice of Elias Vane. Ground. Loop. The technicians assumed it was a test recording. They deleted it, reformatted the drives, and closed the ticket. Outpost 4 is still active today. It sits in the same clearing, surrounded by the same towering hemlocks. It is no longer manned. The cost of insurance for human operators became too high, and the advances in satellite telemetry made physical presence unnecessary. It is fully automated now, a machine talking to other machines. The sensors listen to the Earth. The computers process the data. The uplink beams it to the server farm in Seattle. The baseline is steady. The data is clean. But the archivists who review the raw logs, the ones who work the graveyard shift in the basement of the data center, have noticed a pattern. It happens only when it rains. It happens only when the wind dies down and the heavy, vertical downpour drums against the roof of the container. The seismic monitors pick up a signal. It is faint. It is often filtered out by the noise cancellation algorithms as environmental clutter. But if you turn off the filters, if you look at the raw feed, you can see it. It is a rhythmic, low-frequency spike. 12 hertz. Thump. Pause. Thump. Pause. Thump. It does not come from the Earth. It comes from the perimeter. It moves around the station. It circles the steel box. It stops at the solar array. It stops at the door. And sometimes, just before the signal fades, the audio sensors inside the empty cabin pick up a sound. It is not the wind. It is not the rain. It is the sound of something wet and smooth sliding against the observation window. The machine records it. The machine logs it. And then the machine sends it to the archives, where it sits in the dark, waiting for someone to listen. The archive is now closed. Until we unseal the next file. Sleep well.